Welcome to Constance and to our series today. You might have noticed there won't be a talk every week, so please check the schedule. We also have other events sprinkled in. We have PhD pitches, we have progress talks on ongoing projects that are not going to be recorded, so that's a more of an unofficial character. So we were trying a few things this semester, but as we've done in the previous semesters, there will be invited talks, and it pays to show up when there's something coming up. So thanks. Without much further ado, I hand over to Heiko to introduce today's speaker.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra. Oh, and now it's actually past. Okay, so I thought we still have to fill some minute. It's my pleasure to welcome Roland Bouffanais. I have exercised for 3 days now to get the pronunciation somehow right, but he just told me that he's used to all sorts of wrong pronunciations. So Roland got his PhD from EPFL. And it was also awarded 2 prizes, so that was obviously a great start into your academic career. And it continued like that because then you spent 2 years as postdoc at MIT, where you're also still a research affiliate. Then Roland moved to Singapore University of Technology and Design. You just told me that you spent more than 10 years.
I went 2 times to Singapore, so 2 plus 9, 11 in total.
11 years, and yeah, so
he knows the place.
So Roland obviously didn't want to sweat too much anymore because he moved then to the University of Ottawa in Canada, where they have, what did you say, in January it's minus 25?
Yeah, easily, right.
Celsius?
Yeah, but you still sweat in the summer, so that's...
for 3 years, professor at the University of Ottawa, and that was actually my opening sentence that I missed. So there's a group going from the cluster going to Canada next week, and when I tried at least to prepare something for that, I was like, this is my time to visit Roland, and I Googled him, and then at some point I was like, huh? So I already had the email open, like, hey, dear Roland, I'm going to Canada, and then I was like, oopsie, no, because he moved this summer to University of Geneva. So it makes no sense anymore to search for you in Canada. And that was the moment when I thought like, hey, well then it's easy. We just invite him over and he can give a talk here and then we should connect because we, if I'm not wrong, I think we never met before, which is a shame. Yeah, so now we managed.
I've reviewed so many of your papers, I'm sure
same.
And we're still in good terms.
So it's high time, and so just a few, like 3 sentences on what he's actually doing, but he will tell us much more in a second. So on his research page of his lab, I like this one sentence here a lot. We leverage complexity science to study wicked problems. Nice. And he does research on computational social sciences, multi-agent systems, multi-robot systems, complex urban systems, and then also some data science and AI. So please welcome Roland, and then the stage is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the kind invitation. It's a real pleasure being here. I actually very much prefer being in Constance instead of you coming to Canada. It's lovely. I only got a chance to see the city a bit, but it's a beautiful place, and your center is fantastic. It's a place I have been following for a long time. I know some of you in the room, and it's a pleasure being here. I also appreciate the fact that you are starting earlier than the actual time, so that's a good change from Switzerland. And I'm coming from the French-speaking part of Switzerland, where they're not as rigorous about time as your neighbors here. So today I'll be talking about a combination of things I've been doing, indeed. So it's a bit of an unusual presentation in a sense because you guys are a fairly unusual crowd. Very often when we go to conferences, we have to go back and explain what a complex or collective behavior is. And I guess today I won't have to do that. But let me start with things you have already seen, right? Many complex systems. So I have to start from the beginning, although I know that all of you know all of that. So complex systems, many parts, and they interact, and out of it we have emergent behaviors, hopefully for the best. These are biological examples, and the shark attacking a school of fish, the flock of birds, the ants that are forming bridges, and I have put some of my robots here. And even blockchain uses consensus to operate. And I'm not talking about Bitcoin, I'm talking about blockchain here, the technology, bees. So positive things, but at the same time, it's also for the worse. So let's remember that out of these collective behaviors, you can have a very positive emergent behavior, and that's all of us what we're trying to study, understand why it works so well. But we have to be aware that it's not always the case. So in many social systems, this is what you have. I mean, this is the horrible stampede in Seoul during the Halloween crush. This was in Quebec during the COVID pandemic, where people were arguing about wearing masks and showing that in social systems there is a tendency for people not to come together. So consensus is effectively pushing people apart. Stock market as well, where people just suddenly starts buying worthless stock like GameStop. And so these are just examples. So the agenda for the talk today, so I just gave you a very brief motivation. I'll give you some more biological evidence, and I'm not a biologist, and I know that many of you are probably more expert on that, but it's just to motivate the discussion in terms of talking about consensus and how we can leverage consensus to operate collective behaviors. I'll show some work in swarm robotics as well, where we practically use consensus to perform a task. And I visited Clement's lab where they do that at the micro scale. So I'll show bigger stuff, although I thought my robots were small, but it's all relative, I guess. And the core of the talk today will be on the science of consensus, so more on the theoretical side, trying to really understand I was about to say the physics of consensus. No, it's interdisciplinary, right? So it's really about the science of consensus, how fluctuations can be beneficial or play against consensus building, and then look at these problems from the network science perspective, and going all the way to social problems where you have the so-called social contagions, simple, complex contagions, and some of you working on schools of fish have actually said that the behavior in the school of fish is more of a complex contagion than a simple contagion. So you can stop me at any point in time. So that's the beauty of being in Singapore. It's very sweaty, but at the same time, this is not a movie. I'm showing this because all of you are fascinated by that, I hope, if you're here. And this is not something you will find on the internet because that's my own video that I recorded. I'm not even able to know what kind of insect that is. At the core in Singapore, at the core of the island, you have a nature reserve where it's really the rainforest. And you go there, you have the most amazing insects, lizards that are that big. Here we see a classical lane formation, right? And you have a couple of individuals that, obviously have not understood that the action was in the opposite direction. But very interesting because we have, all of you may have read papers about lane formations, even in human crowds. And I was telling Heiko that in Singapore, it's the best place to see collective behaviors. As soon as you get out of the nature reserve, you go and take the metro, and there you have a human crowd, and you see lane formations, in a similar fashion, and people, going against the flow, watching their phone. Right, so this is another, all right, let me start. You're probably familiar. I'll say a few more words about this. This is a group in Israel that has studied collective transportation, how a group of ants, how they discuss how many of them should be, involved in carrying a Cheerio from one place to another in a particular direction. That one we have seen before. This is again one of my videos where It's another reservoir in Singapore where you have these ants that are realizing that, well, they go downward and they get stuck. And so the dead worm, they went downward. I don't know, maybe because gravity, gave them a push or something. But at the end of the day, they realized that they got stuck here, so they went upward. And well, I don't have the entire movie. I cannot tell you the end, what they did with it, but I'm sure that they put the dead worm to good use. So that is to say, for biological swarms, that there is a collective processing of the information, and then that gives rise to a decision, right? So I'm very interested in collective decision-making based on external information. This one, all of you have seen that, but I'm mentioning this because I will show you the inverse problem. So this is a case where you have one predator that is being detected by the fish here, by the birds, and you have these fantastic evasive maneuvers that we have seen in movies. But I've been studying that problem in reverse, meaning that instead of escaping an attack, let's say that you have intruders, these are these big dots, right? So now this is a simulation, right? My agents are the crosses, very, very basic here. No robots, it's really just a multi-agent simulation. And we have been looking at a particular problem that I think is fairly challenging. And Clement, I went to your lab and you told me that, you look at the problem has to be impossible to solve by a single robot, micro-robot. It's the same here, meaning that we have these dots, and these dots is the target. The target moves very fast, meaning that one single agent is unable to just track that dot because the agents are slower than the dots. So the only way to go after those targets is effectively to have a group strategy, a little bit like what you have in the savannah. We make it difficult as well because there is no signal gradient. So in some problems, you leave a trail and then you can go up the trail. But in this case, it's a binary problem, meaning that you got to be on the dot to sense it, right? You don't see it. You really have to be on it to find it. And as soon as you see it, you pass the information to your neighbors in a particular way, and then they have to react in order to go after it. So no sensors, like extremely short range. On top of that, you may have more than one target. The targets may be nasty targets in the sense that they can be evasive, meaning that they have their own strategy, try to avoid the group of agents going after them. So that's the kind of problem. I won't make a seminar out of this right now, but effectively what we realize is, like for instance, what that K says here is K represents a number you'll see in the next slides where we look at the number of neighbors that we try to engage. Say that K equals to 10 means that each agent will look at the K nearest neighbors and say, guys, I need your help, or I pass you the information. So that agent is on the target, therefore able to tell the others, I see something, right? Because they can't see. That one here is unable to see the targets, right? That one can see it, pass the information, and that information trickles to the neighboring agents. What we see is what we can, think out of intuition, say, well, let's maximize K, right? After all, I'm not paying for the communication because it's a simulation. So let's say that I push the information to everyone. What this shows is that when you do that, like here, K equals to 40, it's all to all. Everybody's aware of the information. You have that kind of bad behavior, right? Bad in the sense of, remember the first slide where you see a stampede, where you see everybody rushing to buy the GameStop stock. This is probably quite ineffective because, and it's actually, we measured it as being very ineffective in a sense because you have these two targets that are free to roam around and do whatever they want to do, right? Whereas in this case, what you have with a smaller K is you have the group being able to kind of do a task allocation on their own. Now the question, of course, is what K value should we have? And that's a little bit what I'm going to talk about today. But in summary for this is what we have found is that in general, it's not, K is just a tool here for us to analyze that particular problem. But the main idea is that what you have when you look at a problem like this, you have a combination of two things, exploration and exploitation. So exploration, because you need to find those targets, because you can't see them. The second part is, once you have found a target, you need to engage in a strategy of exploitation. You need to say, how many of my friends I need to go after that target? And that will depend on the target, how fast the target is moving, how big the target is, elements like that. Of course, it's problem dependent. But effectively, you need to find a fine balance between exploration and exploitation. And that is something we can do through consensus. But not any consensus. I will call this more like a dynamic consensus, because the problem is very much a dynamic problem. If I add another target, then I need to probably tweak my consensus. So that was about this problem. Let me just, as I said, it's a bit of an unusual presentation. I'll show some of the work I've been doing on swarm robotics using consensus. This is back in the days in Singapore where we're working on a problem of environmental monitoring. So effectively, you have a dynamic process at sea. And if you do that on a very large scale, you can use satellite. If you're doing that at the ocean scale, you can use fixed sensors effectively, or at a very local scale, you can just use an individual sensor. And for us, we're very much interested in a surface area of, say, around 1 to 10 kilometers square. So we built that very, very simple robot. I'm not going to say much about this. It's very simple because the goal is to have as many as we can. And some of you working in swarm robotics, you know that, well, then you hit a budget problem, right? So the main idea was let's make something very unsophisticated so that we can maximize our budget. So we made 50 of those units, but they were pretty well designed, I would say. And all the credit goes to my researchers, because I'm not a very handy person. So we made them compact, omnidirectional, self-writing, sea-keeping, because at the end of the day, you had to put them into an environment, at sea. And that was a joint project with a colleague of mine at MIT. What you need to look at here is how consensus is part of what they're doing. All right, so what you see here are the GPS positions corresponding to these motions. And the idea for that problem is, let's say that you have a given field, right, that could be salt, for instance, or an algae bloom or something like that. And you want the robots to effectively measure and then reconstruct the field. And once you have reconstructed the field, you realize that I'm actually not in the right position. I should move in this direction. So it's kind of optimizing the field reconstruction by driving the position according to what you're measuring. And the good thing is, because these robots are floating, you can put a lot of batteries in it, right? It's actually stabilizing them. And you can have a computer on them. So we had a pretty decent computer. And then since you have 50, what you have is a cluster. It's almost like a supercomputer. That's in theory, right? Because in practice, it doesn't always behave that way. But you still have a fairly powerful amount of computing available to operate in a completely distributed way. So you have distributed computing where you do a field reconstruction. All right, so these are some of the measurements. And again, Clement's lab, I saw an aggregation of micro robots. So we like to do that. So we perform this rendezvous in space where effectively you don't tell the robots where to go, but they have to collectively decide to meet at a given location. So these are very well known. So, I mean, there is nothing, we did not invent anything. It was just more at the testing level, see whether this group of 50 robots could talk to one another and decide, flock, move to a particular place and perform, area coverage. So these are the GPS positions measured. So initially we start by distributing them in a given disk. And that's the blue position is the initial position. The red position is halfway through the process. And then at the end, they all meet at the center. This is another one. It looks like a simulation. It's not a simulation that was carried out in a quarry in Singapore. To show you that it's not a simulation, there is one that broke down here. This is real engineering, so it breaks down. And I like to show this because this is showing one of the nice features of swarm robotics, which is effectively the fact that the system is able to continue to operate despite losing, several agents. One here in particular, we lost many more. We had a kayak at that time to go and retrieve the buoys that were not performing well. So this is a leader-follower heading consensus where effectively we took control of one unit only, right? And then the group, through consensus, the group followed that. And I will talk about leader-follower consensus in the second part of my talk. This is another task. So area coverage has been a task that many people have been looking into for a long time, very well studied, but the dynamic area coverage is, in my opinion, more interesting. Why is that? Because in my view, swarm intelligence, you need to have a task that changes over time. So the system has to be challenged. Something has to be new. The system has to react to changes in the environment and therefore, respond to it. So here we have a surface area that our buoys had to occupy. So we had to maximize the occupation. So if you take a disk, well, you do a tessellation here. Mathematically, it's a fancy problem. It's very nice to do. But the idea was to force the system to adapt to changes in the surface. So from that disk, we went into this peanut shape all the way to that where we forced the system to effectively separate on its own. So what is given to the system is just the area to cover, and the robots had to decide on their own how to move. So in red, you can see the traces left by them. Obviously, you have some units that are well positioned to do nothing, and others that are subjected to, effectively a higher task. So I'll skip the measurements, but this is just to show that it works, right? So it works pretty well, I should say, because it's still engineering. This is showing that. All right, just let me pause here. So unfortunately, I cannot show you a view from the top. That would have been nice to have a drone, I know, but this place was next to an Air Force base in Singapore, and there was a big sign saying that no radio-controlled systems, and the police came, and we had to explain that. They asked, are you using anything radio control? I say, it's just an experiment for the university. You say, okay, you guys carry on, right? So this to say that, with science, we can get away with a lot of things, right? So we were not I was not lying to the police officer, because effectively they were talking to one another. So that they were just, the buoys were radio controlling each other. I was just observing. But that's a side view from the quarry. And this is the GPS position. So you see each B stands for Bob, and each of the bees moving. You will see that some are just going to go haywire from time to time, but they are, responding to the change in the environment and coming back. I think this is when B40 goes, is it B40? Yeah. It will happen. It's engineering. Something fails at some point, there you go, I think. Yeah, 49, yeah. 49 had a little bit of was kind of drifting, but not so badly. Anyway,
Can I ask a question?
Of course, yeah.
So the rule is they are supposed to fill in the volume evenly, and they calculate just the forces to their neighbors, like electrons. They have a repulsive. Okay.
Yeah, that's exactly that. So the objective is to minimize. What you want is each agent to have almost the same surface to cover. All right, so, and that's mathematically, it's, this tessellation problem that is fairly challenging. So we added that on top, right? And that's how we measure the performance of the system as well, in terms of making sure that, well, this one here is not doing all the hard work. Then we moved on to a heterogeneous swarm because we realized that some of the buoys that are at the outer part of the diameter of the disk have to move further. So we did what Apple does, right? We just came up with Bob version 1. This is Bob 2, right? Like the iPhone version. So this one is 5 times the price of this one, fancier. It has a touch screen on it. But it worked pretty well, and unfortunately, it was very, very challenging to try to take advantage of those buoys are faster, better, stronger, right? But to try to put this into a system with those that are just not as efficient, it's very hard to just take advantage of that while keeping the distributed system. So what we managed to do, though, is to prove that if you upgrade your system with this one, your system performs better without changing anything. So without knowing that this is version 2 and that's version 1, without doing anything, without upgrading the code and so on, you get a benefit just because these are faster. But trying to go to the next level, which is to design a heterogeneous algorithm, we're still working on it. All right, let's keep that. This is another group of robots, but I just want to show, so that's what we call a micro robot in my world, so 10 centimeters. And what we had here is that these robots are effectively performing a collective mapping task. So this is a lab where we have those fake obstacles, try to make the environment a little bit more complicated. And here we do a scalability experiment. So we look at the robot doing 1 unit, 2, 4, 8, and you will observe how they build the map concurrently, right? And again, this is by using consensus in terms of, because if you don't use consensus here, what happens is that they may all go into one corner and map and remap the environment. And what will be interesting here is, of course, to have an environment that changes over time, make it dynamic. So you have an obstacle or you have a door that opens. Next, we performed a flexibility. You will see a flexibility experiment. So let me just pause here so that you understand what you're looking at. So the flexibility experiment, we have 4 robots, 2 here, 2 there, a space that is not, for the moment, that is not accessible to the robots. So what we'll do at the next level is to remove these planks and open up the space, make it like a dynamic change to the environment. So initially you will look at these 2 robots and these other 2 robots working separately. And as soon as all right, so they're mapping their own pens. Then we open that and they form a group of 4, where now they are able to fully map the environment together. So that's a flexibility experiment. These are measures. I'm going to skip that, and I'd like to move, unless you guys have questions. Yes. Okay. I've been too fast. LiDAR. Right. So it's very short range. For LiDAR, as you can see, this is not a fancy LiDAR. It's a homemade LiDAR, so it's fairly short range. It's not vision. Yeah. Okay. Now, yes, of course. So your question is it truly decentralized peer-to-peer mapping, or is it is the map built separately, right, on the computer? Is that a question? Sure. So how the information is exchanged? So information in that case, it's all to all. So effectively, everybody knows everything. So that's in the long run, what we aim to do is something that is truly localized. But that experiment was they all have the information from the others, and that's because we have 4 robots. So with such a small system, it would make no sense to truly just have the local information. Okay. So we move now to the part that is related to the title of the talk, and I'm going back to the biological evidence. All right. So you should be familiar with the fantastic work by Cavagna and his team in Italy about flocks of birds, where it has been shown that, for instance, only 6 to 8 neighbors, topological neighbors on average, are required to achieve flocking. Then there is this fantastic work as well from that group in Israel, where they studied how ants are modulating their interactions in order to maximize the collective transportation of a cereal. Here, another work by the team by Cavagna on midges. So what can we say? And again, I'm not a biologist, right? So I'm just repeating what the biologists have said for the sake of, analyzing consensus. What we have are systems where there is a lot of fluctuations, right? And the work on midges was particularly interesting because effectively you don't have any apparent order. It's quite hidden. The swarm intelligence is hidden in the fluctuations of the midges. Even when you look at the group of ants with the naked eye, you can barely see that there is a strategy. But in that paper, what they're showing is that there is actually, the group decides, depending on what they're trying to do when they want to steer the Cheerio, to effectively modulate the number of agents. And sometimes, one will move from this side to the back. You have these that are on standby. So you really have a group strategy to achieve maximized performance, right? So that's the starting point for us. So questions are, what about fluctuations? From the perspective of consensus building, is fluctuation helping or is it detrimental? That's actually not a very clear question. And of even higher interest for us is how about external influences? Because at the end of the day, when you have a predator attacking a flock of birds, you have the evasive maneuver that is super effective. The information about the presence of the predator, spreads through the flock in a very effective way. Same story with the fish as well. So those external influences are the ones that are driving the collective behavior and the emergent behavior. So I'm going to start showing some actual results. Back in 2017, so we started from very, very simple models. We went back to Vicchek's model. So I guess everybody here knows Vicchek's model, more or less, right? It's written here. I won't get into the equations except that the consensus is in here. You're taking an average, right? The average direction of travel is based on an average of neighbors. And of course, the question is, how many neighbors do I take into account? The birds are taking 7 to 8. Is it because they have poor eyesight? Is it, why? That's how has always been an interesting question. For the fish, right, we know that there is a particular number of fish involved as well. So the amount of neighbors involved in the consensus is fairly important. So we started from simulations, and what we measured here is this chi here is the susceptibility. From the statistical physics perspective, it's the amount of fluctuations, if you want. So what you're looking at is your agents are never really moving perfectly in one direction. They always have a little bit of fluctuations. And Cavagna and his team they have shown that these fluctuations are actually super important for some of these behaviors. So we went back to Vicchek's model and verified if that was indeed the case with Vicchek's model. And this is what we have. We have the chi, therefore the susceptibility, which is a measure of the level of fluctuations in the system, as a function of k. Here, k is the number of topological neighbors. So we took Vicchek's model with neighbors that are defined just like, for a flock of birds, so topological neighbors. And what you have is that your susceptibility goes up. That we're familiar with. The more neighbors you have, well, the more intense the behavior. So that's pretty well known, I would say. What was interesting is that beyond some level here, the level of fluctuations goes down. So it looks like when you have too many neighbors in Vicchek's model, at some point, it kind of kills the fluctuations that you have in the system. And based on what we have seen, those fluctuations seem to be playing a good role. So then we went to the next step, which is introducing a predator. So the predator here is that big disk here, the red disk, fairly big one. But once again, you know, our agents are the blue arrows. This is really still based on Vishek's model. So two-dimensional, like if some of you are working with fish, I know you're going to be offended by such a simple model, but bear with me. So effectively, you only if the arrow, I won't dare saying fish, right? Only if the blue arrow or the agent is within that disk, they can sense the presence of the predator. And then what we can see is that on this snapshot here is that although these agents can't see the predator, they are responding to it, very much like what you have in a real flock of birds and school of fish. So we went for a very simple metric, which is measuring what we call the mean avoidance time. So this is the time in between two agents being caught by the system. So the higher the mean avoidance times, the better for the system, right? What is being said by biologists is that the collective behavior is meant to protect the group. Of course, you will incur some losses with the agents, but hopefully, as a whole, the system will be able to respond well. So what we measure in red is based on the metric distance, just like in regular Vishek's model, and in blue, the topological distance. And this is showing that regardless of the type of distance you choose, what you have is by increasing the number of neighbors, your avoidance times goes up, meaning that you are swarming in a good way. You are effectively protecting a large number of agents. But again, beyond a certain point, that avoidance times goes down. You are involving too many neighbors, and then the response is less effective. Okay, so that was a good starting point. So we asked ourselves, okay, that is collective motion. Is this phenomenon also true for other collective decision-making processes? So we went for another very simple model, the linear threshold model, or also known as the linear Vardar model. Why is it simple? Well, you are a group of agents now, you don't move, you fix, and the only thing it can do is say yes or no, black or white, whatever you want to do, but it's a binary decision, 1 or 0. And how do you decide? Well, again, you decide based on consensus, based on the average decision of your neighbors. And again, all of this depends on your neighbors, what neighbors you choose, how many neighbors you will involve in that decision-making process. Theta here is the threshold that you define, right? So you have to have, like a fraction of neighbors all deciding to, I don't know, like the new fad or buying the new iPhone, right? And then you get, pushed into it. And what we did was to measure how the decision will spread effectively. So our measure here is what we call the polarization speed. So the polarization is how much the group is going in one direction or the other. But our interest is as soon as you try to flip the system in one direction, how does it propagate through the system? So you measure that through a speed, and that polarization speed is on the y-axis here. So I repeat, my agents are fixed now, and they only collectively decide what to do. And then we chose we had to involve neighbors. So we chose two different network topologies. That's the ring, right? The regular ring, which is a very standard network topology, k nearest neighbors. And this is a random network. And on the x-axis, what you have is the out degree, so how many neighbors you have involved. So once again, what do we see? We see that as you increase the number of neighbors, you benefit, right? You have your positive swarming effect, where effectively the response of the system goes up. The system is able to adjust its polarization faster and faster. But beyond a certain value, regardless of how the neighbors are connected, you will see that the system goes down. So it becomes detrimental to involve too many people in that collective decision. Then yes, please. Yes. So this is the out degree for, each color corresponds to these two network topologies. Out degree because the flow of information is only in one direction in this case. So you look at your neighbors, but they may not look at you in return. So what we have been showing so far is that this is based on evidence, no theory, right? So what we understand is that the network topology seems to be playing a role, and therefore we went into a theoretical model of distributed decision-making, which is the leader-follower consensus model. You may remember from an earlier slide where we had the buoys, right? When one got lost, we're performing a leader-follower. So we took control of one agent, we're driving the system, and the whole pack was following. So no simulations here. It's a first-order linear system consensus because we take the average here. The Aij represents the topology of the network, right? For those of you that are versed into network science, that's the adjacency matrix. But somehow what we control, again, is how many neighbors are involved in the discussion. And we take control of one agent. And through that agent, we inject a signal. And we see how that signal will propagate. We realized that we thought initially that just having a signal going from 1 to 0 would be easier. But actually, it wasn't the case. What we had to do is go back to what people in physics and control call a frequency response, meaning that you drive the system with a signal that is oscillating at a given frequency omega, and now your control parameter is omega. So omega measures the pace of your signal. The lower the frequency, the slower the signal, and then your system has plenty of time to adjust. And what you want to see is how this is going to propagate through the system. So what we had a measure, I spare you the mathematical details, but effectively we had a metric for the collective response, which is that gain here, that is nicely defined mathematically. And what we have on this graph is the gain, so the collective response is a function of the number of neighbors. So what we see here is, so it's a busy graph, but effectively on the top you have low frequency, meaning that the system has plenty of time to adjust. And here you have the highest frequency, and in between you have intermediate frequency. So let me start with the low frequency, because that's something we can easily understand. Low frequency means that the system, the agents have plenty of time to find consensus and settle and follow the leader. So the more neighbors you have, the better, because they have plenty of time to adjust to that consensus. If you go to a very high frequency, what you see is that the more neighbors you involve in your decision, it gets worse, really bad. But in between, you have this frequency, which is shown here, where effectively your response initially goes up, so you have benefit, in adding a number of neighbors, but then beyond a certain point, it goes down. And that is really for one of these intermediate frequencies. So that means that the pace of the problem or how fast you need to adjust to a particular change in the environment is instrumental here. So this is the same, more or less the same kind of analysis or graph, if you want, but shown differently. Now we're showing the gain, which is the collective response, how much the group is able to respond, so the higher the better, not as a function of gain, but as a function of the frequency now. Meaning that if I'm here, I have a slow problem. If I'm here, I have a high problem. And the different colors, they correspond to different ways of connecting the agents. So the red one is the least amount of interactions between the agents. So just k equals to 2, nearest neighbors. And k equals to n here is an all-to-all connectivity. So at low frequency, all-to-all, everybody talks to everybody, you reach consensus like that. But if you go to a much higher frequency, that strategy of all-to-all becomes detrimental. And what you see here is that clearly what you should do is minimize your connections. Of course, these two extreme cases are, in my opinion, not the most interesting part. The most interesting part is here, in between, where you don't have something too excessive, too slow, too fast. Where you have a given problem at a given pace, where then you see that it's a mess. How do you choose the neighbors? Well, it would actually depend on the frequency omega. So I'm going to skip that, and the experiments are actually not very impressive, but just to show, we used these robots to now perform a heading consensus experiment based on, this is high frequency, right? So this is the leader, right? And then we connected the robots according to the network topology we had. And then the leader, we took control of it and so you just go around in circle and you look at how the others are just here, they're performing not too bad, and here it's terribly bad. Not easy to see, but it's easier on that graph. This is an experimental result where we show the collective response of that group of 11 robots for 4 different frequencies. And for the smallest frequencies, you add more robots, the better. Okay, and this is 10 only, right? We went from 2 to 10 robots. Believe me, it was quite painful to perform these experiments, repeat the experiments, and repeat again to have a variability that was under control. That's the life of a PhD student, I guess, to suffer through repetitive experiments. But here what we see is that for the 2 lowest frequency, well, you add more neighbors and it's better. But as soon as you go beyond a certain frequency here, the more neighbors you add and then your performance goes down. I'm going to just move quickly to that part of social contagion. Where am I going with the social contagion? Once we got these results, we felt like this is insufficient because this is just looking at one problem, which is how many neighbors. And there is a well-known problem, the problem of social contagions, where it's not so much about how many neighbors you have, but it's how you're connected to your neighbors. So this is the work by Damon Santola on complex contagions, mostly for social problems where what we understand very well are simple contagions, where it's just like a virus spreading, right? All of us experienced that not long ago, where you just need to have one contact to catch the virus. This is a very simple viral contagion, simple contagion. But Santola in his work realized, and this is back to 2007, that some propagation of behaviors are complex in the sense that they require a social reinforcement. So you don't need one contact, you need several contacts to be able to adopt a behavior. So this is true for the adoption of innovations. This is true for a number of other behaviors, including fads and social systems. So the question we ask ourselves is, well, can you have a complex contagion? And some people in this room actually said that for School of Fish, it was a complex contagion. And we ask ourselves, can we prove that? And so the catch was that the work by Santola was limited to one class of collective decision-making processes. It was limited to a linear threshold model where the decision was 0 or 1, just binary. Now, if you take a School of Fish, it's not 0, 1, it's going to be continuous. So if you have now a continuous variable, or if you take a consensus problem like that involving a continuous variable, can you experience complex contagions? And in that work, we have been able to uncover that complex contagions can occur in systems where it's a linear problem, right? So there is no nonlinearity or anything. There is no threshold. It's purely linear, and in that case, what we have is still the collective response as before, still the frequency on the omega axis, and what we proved now. So we stopped playing with the number of neighbors. Okay, we took one number of neighbors, but then we modified how the neighbors were connected. So in order to play with that, you play with the topology of the network. So you play with quantities such as the clustering. So how many triangles do you have between your neighbors? And you play with the shortest path. What is the distance between your neighbors? What is well known from the work by Santola for the linear threshold model is that if the problem is dependent on the distance, on the network distance, it's a simple contagion. Right? I make it short, right? And if it depends on the clustering, then it's a complex contagion. So in our problem, we tried to look at that, and we looked at the correlation. So C is the clustering, L is the shortest path, RG is another measure of distance. But what we see here is that the big problem we face is that as you modify one quantity, when you play with the network, you modify everything. So we were not able with that to show that effectively in this region at low frequency, well, it was actually uncorrelated with everything. I mean, it was negatively correlated with everything and positively correlated with everything. We're not able to say that this is due to this or that. So what we had to do is take another sample of networks where we were able to disentangle the effects. So what we see is that at low frequency, what you have is a negative correlation with the distance, just like a simple contagion. You have a zero correlation with the clustering. The clustering plays no role. But as soon as you increase the frequency, then the clustering, the response is entirely based on the clustering. So this is showing that at higher frequency, we have a complex contagion. So effectively in those consensus, in collective behaviors based on consensus, depending on the pace at which you're trying to have your system respond, it may be beneficial to use a simple contagion, or it may be beneficial to use a complex contagion, but that will depend on the system. So now if you think in terms of a school of fish responding to an attack, it's pretty fast. So it seems to corroborate the idea that the school of fish will benefit from a complex contagion at higher frequency. And we did again the experiment with the robots. So here still the same robots as before, the leader in yellow, and then we use different topologies. In particular, we use that one, the caveman network. So if you don't know what the caveman network is, it's a very fancy network that has a super high level of clustering. And what we see is that the green curve, which is the caveman network, at a higher frequency, was actually giving you the best response, the best collective response. At low frequency, it's all the same, because we have only 10 robots and the network distance is so short. So there is no way you can differentiate. The simple contagion is just like super efficient with whatever network you have. But as soon as you increase the frequency, you don't want to be random, because this is where you have the lowest clustering and therefore the lowest collective response. All right, so I'm going to go to conclusions here. And conclusions, I'm sorry I've been a bit fast at the end, but what we see is that if you are studying a behavior, a collective behavior that uses consensus, there is a lot of potential, but there are a lot of intricacies as well in terms of how you want to get your neighbors to help you. And it's not just about the system itself, it's about the task they're trying to accomplish. So for me, the main takeaway through all that work, my biggest surprise was the fact that it's actually the frequency of the leader, meaning that it's the pace of the problem that you're studying that will effectively drive the choice of the topology. All right, as an engineer, what you want to do is say, how am I designing my swarm of robots to perform a task? I say, well, give me the task first. Let's see how fast you need to accomplish that, and then I will decide how to connect my agents and use consensus in hopefully the most effective way. And with that, I'd like to thank my past researchers. All of them have contributed in a way or another for all these experiments. And if you have any questions.
Thank you, Roland, so much. We've already spent a few minutes on questions, but maybe we can spend just a few more. Are there any questions? Yeah.
Thanks for the very interesting talk. Okay. I have a question regarding the first part, like the science report paper.
No, scientific report.
Scientific
this
report.
One here?
Yes,
yeah.
Exactly. So at first, it's quite surprising that doesn't seem to have much difference between the metrical topological neighborhood. But then I realized that if you really count into like the out degrees you have, then they're probably the same number of k, meaning the same. Exactly the same group of neighbors you are choosing, right? Because you choose from the nearest, starting from the nearest. And I wonder if here you also imply like a Voronoi neighborhood, or like if you have obstructions on the neighbors themselves. So this will more evenly distribute the neighbors that you pick from, like different directions regarding your headings. Do you think that affects on the results?
Great questions. Thank you. So you're right to say that it's not surprising that the two curves are kind of giving the same thing, because the density is pretty high, right? So obviously, I think if I remember well, we had something around 2,000 agents, pretty high density of agents, and you can see it here with the naked eye. So because of that density, the mean number of neighbors, I mean, for the topological distance, it's not the mean, right? It's actual k, but for the metric, we used the average of k that end up being the same. Back to your question we actually thought about the Voronoi, and it was so complicated to calculate that for each and every iteration that we initially thought, oh, we'll have the 3, right? And this is laziness on our side. So it was really because it was taking too long. Now, so therefore I don't have the answer, but I would suspect, I mean, other groups have shown that the topological distance and the Voronoi distance are very close in many cases. So given the density, I suspect it should be the same, but I don't have the results. Yeah.
Well, that depends on what is the number of topological neighbors that you choose, right? Because for Voronoi, this is determined by the distribution of your neighbors. Yeah. Especially in the case of vision model, vision-like model, you have point-like particles, which means that they could be super close to each other. Like the local density is not homogeneous.
Yeah. Ian has a question.
Thanks very much. That was absolutely fantastic. It's a kind of a follow-up, really. So one way to sort of get at this is to actually test it experimentally. It's a bit like you mentioned our complex contagion work with the fish. We got to that because we just tested it. What type of contagion is it? And it was a complex contagion. So we also had a paper where we did the same with respect to Voronoi, metric, topological, or visual, right, interactions. And this was led by Ari Strandberg-Peshkin, for those who know her here in this community. There what we could do is we could perturb one or a number of individuals in different contexts. For example, you can have alarm or you can have leadership, where you can train individuals to a green laser stimulus and then they can lead others. And we found that the metric and topological equally performed terribly. They were absolutely not how the information propagated. The Voronoi network was the best sort of, if you're going to do a cheap and cheerful way of connecting neighbors, that was the closest to reality. But the visual network, of course, was by far the best predictor of how information spreads through the group. So I suspect very strongly the same will be true of the Starlings. I think that if you test these things directly, you often get a different answer than these kind of indirect measures. And one example of this is the fluctuations that you mentioned in the midges. Yep. A group at Stanford has followed up on that and has taken the midges into the lab, and these fluctuations disappear. Now, why that's the case is because these fluctuations are the scale-free fluctuations of air currents, and the midges are getting buffeted around by air currents. So you can get a misleading result sometimes if you think it's internally generated. There's no reason in the case of midges why they should be scale-free. There's no principled way because they're all fighting for access to females. The Starlings is still an open case, and we've got some evidence in fish that it is. But anyway, I think it's fascinating. And I would really love to chat to you more about how the visually mediated interactions give rise to very, very interesting network characteristics that are not the same as you get with other networks. And it could be an interesting addition to your work.
No, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ian. I think time is running, so we should conclude here. If you still have questions, feel free to come over and approach Roland.
If I may just add one thing.
Oh, sure.
Actually, the inspiration came from your papers for the complex contagion. So the credit, now, and I'm serious, is we read, I don't know how many times, we read complex contagion in the School of Fish, and then with the work by Santola, we felt like there is a missing link, right? So that was really something. So yeah, let's continue the. Yeah, that's actually, I always wondered why the cover page of the book has fish. Yeah, that's right. Knowing that he's only studying human beings, but that's a different debate for another day. Thank you very much again for.
Thank you, Roland. Thank you.